over 100 years, Warehouse Row and the surrounding area has played an integral role in business and government in Chattanooga. Chattanooga business leaders created the Stone Fort Land Company in the late 1800s, and despite a rocky start, eventually created a center for both the private and public sectors that continues today. An area that was originally used as a fort to protect the city was developed into a bustling area with government buildings, retail and wholesale businesses, and hotels. But Chattanooga was like many cities in the second half of the 20th century in the United States. By mid-century, urban and industrial areas and city centers started a steady decline. Older buildings in downtown Chattanooga were becoming obsolete for their original uses, while at the same time the railroad's prominence in downtown was ending. While the Warehouse Row buildings continued to be occupied, by the 1970s the buildings were partially vacant and deteriorating. A historic resources survey conducted in the mid-1970s identified the buildings as having significance both historically and architecturally. In 1980, they were determined to be eligible for the National Register and officially listed in 1984. Thankfully, the Warehouse Row buildings survived and avoided demolition. In the mid-1980s, efforts for adaptive reuse projects began to take place. Although somewhat controversial by the standards of historic preservation, the Warehouse Row buildings were saved by converting them to an in-town shopping center. The interiors of many of the buildings were altered so shoppers could stay inside, much like the design of a shopping mall. While these adaptive reuse plans saved the buildings from demolition, it also destroyed much of the historic integrity of the interiors. Although Warehouse Row has changed hands multiple times since the 1980s, and some of its preservation is controversial, it continues to embrace its past while attracting upscale businesses. Despite the alterations, Warehouse Row is an important part of the preservation of Chattanooga's past.
The Warehouse Row site was originally used as an American Civil War fort under Union occupation of the city in 1864, named Fort Jones. It was a stone fort constructed on the site as part of the city's defenses. It was abandoned in 1864, a year prior to the Civil War's end in 1865. In 1886, the site was bought by the Stone Fort Land Company. John Wesley Adams and Ohio investors started the Stone Fort Land Company. Their plan was to level the stone fort, sell the rock, and develop a commercial area. J.W. Adams was an architect and developer who had previously worked for John C. Stanton, who built the Stanton House, a hotel in 1871. The Stanton House was later demolished in 1906 for Chattanooga's new terminal station, now known as the Chattanooga Choo-Choo. The Stone Fort Land Company cleared a portion of the site in 1891 and built the U.S. Customs House and Old Courthouse in 1893. It was built to house the Federal Post Office and other U.S. government offices and was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1973. In 1897, the city of Chattanooga offered the Stone Fort Land Company $10,000 for the lot on what was then the corner of 11th and 8th Street, which is now known as Lindsay Street, as a site for a new high school. The offer was later withdrawn as many parents wrote to the committee that the location was unsuitable for a high school because it was close to the railroad. In 1903, Z.C. Patton and his nephew John A. Patton bought the Stone Fort Land Company. Z.C. Patton was from New York and fought for the Union and was wounded in the Battle of Chickamauga during the Civil War. After the war, he moved to Chattanooga and made a fortune in patent medicines. One was a liver regulator that Patton renamed the Black Draught. Another was the wine of Cardew, which was for female ailments. Patton helped start the Chattanooga Medicine Company, which is still active today and known as Chatham, which is now owned by a French company, Sanofi. John T. Lupton, the son-in-law of Z.C. Patton, acquired both shares, taking full control of the company. John T. Lupton is better known for his success and partnership with Benjamin Franklin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead in founding the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. In 1904, the Stone Fort Land Company, under John T. Lupton, constructed its first building, located on Market Street, south of East 11th Street.
Prominent Atlanta architect Walter T. Downing was hired to design the first warehouse building for the Stone Fort Land Company, the Trotter Building, after designing Z.C. Patton's house in Chattanooga Valley. John T. Lupton was also hired to design his house, a 34,000 square foot mansion known as Lyndhurst. Throughout the early 1900s, Downing was hired to design many buildings in Chattanooga. These include multiple buildings on UTC's campus, including Patton Chapel, Race, Hooper, and Founders Hall, as well as a number of the original buildings on the Baylor School campus. Patton hired Downing to design the Hotel Patton, 1 block north of the Trotter Building. The hotel opened in 1908 with 251 rooms and was considered Chattanooga's first skyscraper. The initial hotel rate was $1.50 a night, featuring a billiard room, bowling alley, barbershop, orchestra room, and more. William Howard Taft, Warren G. Harding, and John F. Kennedy all stayed either or spoke in the hotel before it was converted into apartments in the late 1900s. Downing kept some of his familiar elements in his design for the hotel, including his pointed arches. In the early 1900s, Warehouse Row was an integral part of the rapid growth in Chattanooga's industrial, manufacturing, and warehousing business from the late 1800s through the early 1900s. At the time of its construction, Warehouse Row was located across Market Street from the rail yards servicing the Union Depot. The location near the railroad was very attractive to business owners in Warehouse Row. By 1910, Warehouse Row was located between two of the major railroads servicing Chattanooga. As seen in this 1914 plat map of the area, a private rail spur from the Southern Railway was extended to serve the warehouses. Remnants of this spur line can be seen today behind the former freight depot. For decades after its construction, the Warehouse Row buildings remained relatively unchanged. According to the National Park nomination in 1977, the buildings were described as possessing a remarkable degree of current retention of the original facades. Prior to its redevelopment, the Warehouse Row buildings were listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1984 as the Market Street Warehouse Row Historic District. In 1999, Warehouse Row, along with the other Stone Fort Lane Company buildings, such as the Customs House, Lupton Building, and Hotel Patton, were listed as the Stone Fort Lane Company Historic District in the National Register.
With the completion of the Trotter Building in 1904, it was leased to the Trotter Brothers Wholesale Grocery Company, the company from which this building owes its name. Following this, additional warehouse buildings were constructed adjacent to the original. One, housing the Stagmeyer and Fletcher Wholesale Grocer, was constructed in 1905, with two final buildings built in 1906, housing Tom Fritz Hardware, Archer Paper Company, and James Supply Company. All four buildings would form a section of Warehouse Row known as the Northern Block. Four additional buildings, making up the Southern Block, were constructed between 1909 and 1929, also housing a variety of hardware, supply, and wholesale grocery companies. The architectural style of the Warehouse Row buildings of both the Northern and Southern blocks are closely uniform and reflects the styles commonly found in many commercial buildings of the early 20th century. These row-style warehouses range between 3 and 5 stories with rectangular brick facades, 2 to 5 bays of windows with either flat or arched lintels, and flat-topped roofs with terracotta coping. Originally, the interiors of these warehouses were equally consistent and functional, with structural brick and wooden post interiors with wood floorings, creating large open workspaces. Brick walls would have originally divided each warehouse building, separating each company into a single leased space, each with individual entrances. While the initial Trotter Building maintains a more rectangular four-wall design, the subsequent buildings sport a more asymmetrical floor plan, while still maintaining a four-wall design. Each building varies in the level of the floor plan, color of brick, lintel style, and other minor decorative differences. While built with functionality in mind, a combination of detailing such as arched lintels and decorative brickwork give this collection of buildings a simple, uniform industrial style while not having a total utilitarian facade. One building, the Stagmeyer and Fletcher Wholesale Building, has a unique V-shaped facade conforming to the angled street. From its construction, Warehouse Row has catered primarily to wholesale and grocery tenants, taking advantage of the rail connection for the transportation of goods. Mr. W. H. Trotter of the Trotter Brothers Company described the benefit of the urban location and the railroad connection as the legitimate location of the future jobbing business. Another man who saw the financial prospects of Warehouse Row was John Stagmeyer. Described by the Loveman Banks, Chattanooga's best product, as one of Chattanooga's self-made men, this businessman and philanthropist owned multiple stakes in Warehouse Row, owning the Stagmeyer and Fletcher and the Archer Paper Companies.
Newspaper articles announced in 1983 that the warehouse had been purchased by a Boston architectural firm. By 1984, officials say that the new project will house a shopping mall featuring a 450-car parking garage and pedestrian walkway to the TVA complex. Construction begins in 1985, and the architect's plans change to exclude both the walkway and the garage, but to keep the large, ultra-modern glass atrium right in the center of the old warehouses. Renderings of the new design were released to the public, and construction continued with the help of several $1 million from the city of Chattanooga. Plans to complete the project by the fall of 1985, with all leased spaces occupied by the next summer, were quickly and completely halted by the National Park Service on the grounds that the new design of the buildings would completely destroy its historic character. Upon spending $50,000 to appeal this ruling, it was rejected by the National Park Service and new plans were needed. Many revisions and millions of dollars later, Warehouse Row was approved for historic tax credits in 1986 and came to new ownership in 1987 by a Chicago firm. The shopping center and office spaces were completed in the fall of 1989. Now home to Prime Outlets, the new Warehouse Row unfortunately lost a lot of its historic integrity throughout the renovations. As the buildings were built at different times, their floors were at slightly different elevations, so the levels of the building did not line up. The new interior was significantly altered to allow these varying floor levels to now line up. This can be seen from the exterior with windows which appear to be out of line. The new interior also featured white paint, black and white tile flooring, and windows surrounding an open atrium. After extreme success downtown, Warehouse Row has successfully adapted to the area and modern needs. In 2006, Jamestown Properties purchased Warehouse Row for $14 million and began to remodel in the early 2010s to include more upscale dining and shopping options. This also somewhat restored some of the initial historic integrity of the building, although the original was impossible to replicate. Finally, Warehouse Row was purchased again in 2016 by an Atlanta real estate group for an unknown amount and continues to be a successful downtown revitalization project today. While it is not the best example of proper historic preservation, it is still an important example of saving a building and not letting it be lost to a changing and evolving urban environment.